In the previous video, we had talked about fresco painting and what it took to create them. One last fresco painting we'll look at from the island of Crete is this spring fresco, which dates around 1650 to 1625 BC. The main thing you need to know, besides that it is done in the fresco style or using the fresco medium, is that this is really a very naturalistic landscape compared to one that would have people in it. So we can easily say that these people were very much focused on the environment and on the landscape. In other comparisons, we can look at the animals that are seen in the prehistoric cave paintings. In the lower right, we see T on a hippopotamus hunt. And in the below left, we have the Ashurbanipal II killing lions. Again, both figures and animals are present in these works, yet on the island of Crete, we have this spring fresco that is devoid of both animals and humans. So we have the snake goddess here, and this was also found in the palace at Knossos in one of the storerooms. Dates from 1750 to 1550 BC, only about 12 inches tall. And we're not really sure what to make of this work. This wasn't the only snake goddess that was found, but it's the one that's the most famous. You can see that she has bare breasts, her arms are raised, snakes clenched in her fists, and there's either a leopard or a cat perched above her hat. It's just a very awkward, odd scene, and she looks very angry. Here's one of the other snake goddesses that we found, very similar, and this is a fairly traditional Minoan dress. The Minoans were also extremely gifted pottery makers, as mentioned when we were talking about the palace at Knossos. So we're going to take a look at a few of the different pottery that was made. The chimerosware jug is really cool because it's technically advanced. We have a handle, we have a pour spout, and not only that, it is also aesthetically pleasing as we have this design on the outside of it. The octopus flask is in literally all the art history books as well as the regular history books that deal with ancient civilizations. It's just a really cool object. And the shape of the flask itself lends itself to the subject matter of the octopus, almost as if it is inside the jar that would be clear glass. And of course, this is a very seafaring kind of civilization, and so we always have sea creatures in a lot of the artworks. Of course, that's not the only octopus flask that is created. These are also octopus flasks, but they're not nearly as authentic or realistic as the previous work. In fact, the work here at the right looks very much abstracted. The harvester vase is probably my favorite vase because it is fairly small. It's basically a shot glass, about 4.5 inches tall, and archaeologists have yet to find one that is unbroken. It is unique because along the circumference you have about 27 figures that look as if they're marching off to some type of festival, ceremony, or even a harvest. And to me, there's always been this audible quality that is present. But it was used for drinking on special occasions. These would have also been covered in gold leaf. So let's move over now to the Greek mainland. And as I mentioned earlier in part 1 of the lecture, the Mycenaean culture is one that is very aggressive, and we can see that in the architecture. Most of the architecture we find are citadels, fortifications, and that have fortifications that are extremely well built, literally 25 feet wide, 30 feet tall. And this is a complex that was continually rebuilt. So each new renovation had a fortification wall placed outside the previous one. These are also called Cyclopean architecture because it was thought that the Cyclops was the only figure that would have been strong enough to literally move these stones into place. Of particular interest at the citadel at Mycenae is the Lion's Gate. And the lions themselves stand about 9.5 feet tall to give you an idea of height. Their faces are gone. They would have originally been made out of gold or bronze, and so the precious metals were stolen centuries ago and melted down. With the image at the right, I want to point out one of the building structures that we're going to see in the early civilizations. This would be considered a post here, and the crossbar a lintel, and then of course a post on the other side. So post and lintel architecture is something we'll see in the Greek civilization, in the Romans, and so on. And even today, this is how we as kids build things with blocks. We have the posts that are upright that support the lintel strong enough, putting enough downward pressure to keep the posts in place. This is the grave circle here, and it's kind of in the lower right-hand side of the original image that we looked at, the aerial view of the citadel at Mycenae. And originally this was outside of the original fortification, but because this was renovated and built on and on too, now it's inside the last fortification. With graves here, these are called shaft graves, meaning that they were deep in the ground, basically about 20 to 25 feet deep. These are where not only people but artifacts would have been buried. And it's great because if you are a grave robber, you're not going to spend the time looting a shaft grave. So the material and artifacts we get out of these are really important. Some other graves we'll look at later, unfortunately, are not. They were very easily looted. One of the artifacts we pull out of the shaft grave is the funerary mask of Agamemnon from the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. Dates to 1600 to 1500 BC. There is some argument as to whether or not this mask has been kind of changed or distorted by the person who dug it up. There are other masks that don't look anything near like this. But you can again see how good of a metal worker that these people are. And of course, a very wealthy civilization or culture. Here's a couple of the other masks, and so you can see these are not nearly as defined, particularly the work at the left, compared to the mask of Agamemnon. This dagger was also found in one of the shaft graves. The scene is inlaid, and various materials were used to create it. We've got copper as well as gold. The scene is a lion attacking a deer, and 4 other animals are kind of running away in fear. Now, the other tombs that we have that people were buried in, particularly royalty, are the Tholos tomb, the beehive tomb it's called. The largest one is this one. There were actually about 100 of these found already. But the largest one we call the Treasury of Atreus. And it is really a remarkable structure when we go inside. This is the largest uninterrupted space made in the ancient world, all the way up to the building of the Pantheon by the Romans around 125 AD. And this is where royalty would be buried. They would have been dressed up in opulent dress and jewelry, surrounded with ceremonial weapons and other articles of gold and silver to show status and wealth and power, of course. The walkway that we looked at previously was 114 feet long, 20 feet wide. Entrance door itself 16.5 feet tall. The interior of the tomb 47 feet in diameter, 43 feet high, and of particular significance, like we saw the post and lintel building technique with the Lion's Gate. Here we have what's called corbelling, where each layer of blocks is set slightly inward from the other. And so this basically serves as a crude form of an arch. And we can kind of see how if we spin an arch 360 degrees, we create a hemisphere. The idea behind the arch and behind corbelling is the pressure from the upper stones is diverted off to the sides of the structure rather than straight down, making the space collapse. So here, everything is diverted in terms of weight, and we can create something that's roughly 40 feet in diameter. Corbelling is useful up to about that space. If we try to go 50 or 60 feet, it tends to collapse, but around the early part of the 1st or 2nd century AD, we start to have the Romans inventing the arch, and we can make much grander spaces and buildings and such. A couple of final images we'll look at. One is the Vaffio cup. You can see that the image is of a person tying up the hind legs of a bull, and this is made with hammering the gold from the inside of the cup or of the sheet of gold, and then it was made into a cup. And the metal workers here would have been Minoan, but this was found on the Greek mainland after the end of the Minoan civilization. So we feel that at least some of the Minoans made it to the Greek mainland. And our final image is that of the warrior vase. You have a figure barely seen at the far left, seems to be a female waving these soldiers goodbye, and they walk away single file. Very flat, very even two-dimensional, and somewhat abstract in terms of form. This is called a crater, as the official name of the pottery, and those were used for mixing wine and water. And they were not only used in feasts, but also as grave markers, which we'll see in a little bit later. I have a great example in the Greek civilization. But this is one of the last works made, or at least we've recovered from the Mycenaean culture. After this, the Aegean world kind of heads into a dark age. But when we emerge on the other side next week, we're going to be talking about the world of ancient Greece.